Vaudeville is one of the forgotten forms of entertainment, but in its heyday, it was enormously popular. Most people don't realize the influence vaudeville had on popular culture and entertainment. But what was vaudeville, and how did it influence society? Let's find out. First, what was vaudeville? Vaudeville was essentially a variety show in a theater. You could find almost any kind of act at a vaudeville theater. By the 1920s, the varieties seemed endless. The most popular were comedy routines and music, and these two were often combined. There were so many kinds of acts, including magicians, jugglers, performing animals, tap dancers, ventriloquists, strongmen, and so on. Vaudeville began in a slightly different form in the mid-19th century, mostly catering to lower classes who had a more raunchy, earthy sense of humor. The concept originally came from France, hence the French-sounding name. Vaudeville quickly spread around Europe and to the United States. These early American shows were heavily influenced by the minstrel shows and medicine shows of the mid and late 19th century. By the late 19th century, vaudeville had earned a more respectable reputation and had become instantly recognizable from other types of variety shows. Vaudeville was characterized by circuits, which were tours along a specific path. Vaudeville companies hired acts and put them in their lineup. The golden age of vaudeville was probably around the turn of the century, when the circuits around the country seemed completely endless. Vaudeville's closest relatives and competitors were circuses and burlesque theaters. All had similarities, but slight differences separated them into different categories. And all had acts more or less exclusive to that category. First, circuses were set up outside, while vaudeville troupes moved from theater to theater, and burlesque theaters had their own theater with house acts. Circuses were usually the only place to find clowns, trapeze acts, and acts involving large animals such as lions and elephants. Though of course, there were some crossovers. And burlesque shows, while they did have comedy and musical acts, the main event was a striptease, which didn't really happen in vaudeville. Vaudeville mostly focused on comedy and musical acts, but was also the more likely of the three to have acts like tap dancers and ventriloquists. While vaudeville was obviously in decline by the 1920s, it still had an impact. In the early part of the decade, there were still many top-bill vaudeville performers, but it was clear to everyone by the end of the decade, including the performers themselves, that vaudeville was on its way out. So why did vaudeville die? To put it simply, it just became an outdated means of entertainment. Just like television killed radio in the 1950s, the advent of moving pictures had a big negative impact on vaudeville. Films offered more to its audience than vaudeville could offer, despite its wide variety of acts. And when it became obvious to top-tier performers that there was a lot more money in film or on Broadway, they quickly jumped ship. So what was left were mostly more amateur acts and novelty acts. That's not to say that there weren't any more talented performers in vaudeville at that time, but most performers with established names had left the vaudeville circuit, bringing a large amount of their audience with them. When commercial film was beginning to take over the industry, many vaudeville theaters installed film equipment to incorporate into the show, but there were still live performances as well. Then by the 1920s, some vaudeville theaters had either been converted into movie theaters or just shut down entirely. The tragedy of vaudeville is that little physical record of it survives. Most of what we have left of vaudeville are posters, flyers, and advertisements. Vaudeville shows were rarely filmed, since by the time film had become profitable enough to do so, it was in decline. The film record of vaudeville is usually a little out of context, since it was not really filmed at an actual vaudeville performance, but rather one staged specifically to be filmed. Take this example, A Few Moments with Eddie Cantor from 1923. While it was really a routine taken from a Broadway play he was starring in, it was something that Cantor might have typically done for his act. Instead, we have clues as to what vaudeville was like through the performers who later switched to film or radio. This is where vaudeville had a massive influence. For me, personally, whenever I think of vaudeville, a long list of comedians come to mind. For example, Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, the Marx Brothers, Jack Benny, Fred Allen, W.C. Fields, George Burns, Gracie Allen, George Jessel, Eddie Cantor, and so on. All of these famous entertainers were former vaudevillians who moved on to film and radio. Parts of their routines from their days in vaudeville were later recycled for use in their radio and television shows, but how much is difficult to find out. So vaudeville remains on the extreme outer peripheries of our cultural memory. Many other vaudeville performers weren't so lucky. Most faded into obscurity, their talent no longer desired, and spent the rest of their lives reflecting on their past fame while working at a normal job. Others continued in vaudeville as it died, getting less and less money as the years went by. Outside of comedy and musical acts, most performers performed a novelty, something which would almost never last in popularity. Only the greatest performers with a timeless talent could survive into the new entertainment mediums. Vaudeville was more influential than most people realize, especially since many people don't even know what it is. But its influence on the variety show format is undeniable. While vaudeville died, its legacy reached as far as television. For example, Milton Berle, who was the king of early television, often used his old vaudeville routines in his television show. And this show was a huge influence on everything that came after it. So we should all take a moment to appreciate the contributions of vaudeville on popular entertainment. It provided a sound base for so much of our entertainment today in some shape or form. It's just a shame we can't actually experience it anymore. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any suggestions for topics, please let me know in the comments. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.